What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. In this video, I'm going to show you how to build this custom album art door for the IKEA Expedit or Kallax shelving system. It's super simple. It's built from plywood, epoxy, and aluminum, and you need almost no woodworking tools to be able to make it. So let's get started. First, I cut my Pure Bond walnut veneered plywood to size on the table saw. If you don't have a table saw, you could have your local Home Depot make this cut for you. I ran into a bit of a conundrum when sizing these doors. The opening on the IKEA Kallax shelves are just over 13 inches square, and plywood comes in 2-foot increments. So if I were to cut the doors to the exact size of the opening on the Kallax, I'd be wasting almost half my plywood. Because of that, I decided to go with a door size of 11 7/8 of an inch square so that I could get 4 doors out of one 2-foot by 2-foot Pure Bond project panel. Once the plywood was cut to size, it was time to add the album art. So I had these album covers printed at my local Office Depot for about $12 for both album covers, and you can easily find high-resolution scans of most popular album covers online. Once I had them printed, I cut them to size and used spray adhesive to attach the art to the plywood. With the art attached, I wanted to add a layer of epoxy resin to both protect the artwork and give it a nice look. I used art resin for this, which you might have seen in some of my previous videos, and art resin is designed for exactly this type of process. I mixed up the amount I needed, 12 ounces in this case for both doors. I stirred it for 3 minutes, and then I poured it on. I spread the epoxy relatively evenly, but art resin is self-leveling, so I didn't really need to get it perfect. Once the entire surface was covered, I used a propane torch to bring any air bubbles to the surface of the epoxy and pop them. And with the bubbles removed, I just left the epoxy to cure for about 48 hours. Once the epoxy had cured, I cleaned up the back of the door using a card scraper and random orbit sander. After sanding, I vacuumed any dust off the surface and applied a few coats of spray polyurethane to the back and sides of the door. Next, I got to work on the frame. For the frame, I used 1/16 inch thick, 3/4 inch wide aluminum angle that I picked up at my local home center. I cut the pieces at 12 3/4 of an inch long with a 45-degree miter on each end. And these aluminum pieces come in 4-foot increments, so I needed 3 pieces for 2 doors. I used a process called aluminum brazing to assemble the frame, and this was a process I had never attempted before. There are a few steps before getting to brazing. First, I beveled the edges slightly to allow more of the filler material to penetrate the joint. I just used a file for this, and I also used a metal brush to remove any surface imperfections. For the brazing, I used MAP gas and a Bernzomatic TS8000 torch. I'll have a link in the video description to the exact items I used if you want to try this yourself. It is possible to braze using a propane torch, but the heat output is much lower and it will take much longer to get the metal to temperature. So I applied heat to the joint for about 30 seconds and then started dragging the brazing rod across the joint. The goal is not to melt the rod with the torch in the air, it needs to melt from the heat from the joint itself, and the filler will flow along the heated area and will fill in the joint. I also tried to add some more filler on the opposite side of the joints, but by the time the metal heated enough for the filler rod to melt, the filler that was already in the joint melted as well, and this happened. So let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's project, Pure Bond Plywood. As I mentioned earlier, I'm using Pure Bond's plywood project panels for this project, and these panels come in all sorts of really cool veneer options. I've used the walnut panels in a bunch of my previous projects and love the quality. Pure Bond plywood is just really awesome stuff, great to work with, and super high quality. It's domestically made, formaldehyde free, and these project panels can be ordered on HomeDepot.com and shipped right to your doorstep. You can even give them the dimensions you want the piece cut to, and they'll ship it to you already pre-cut. Check out the link in the video description below to learn more. Once I had all the joints brazed together, I let them cool and then used a belt grinder to get them flush. I also tried using a random orbit sander to smooth things out, but it left a really weird surface texture that I wasn't a huge fan of. Didn't really matter though, since the next step was to paint the frame black. I just used a few coats of spray paint and let it dry overnight. With the frame and door finished, it was time to attach them to each other. I just used a little 5-minute epoxy on each inside corner of the frame and cut a few spacer blocks so that the door would be held in place while the epoxy dried. The last step in the project was to add the hardware to the door. I decided to use European style hinges for this project, and I'll have a link in the video description to the exact hinges I used. These were really simple to install. I just drilled a hole with a 1 5/8 inch Forstner bit using my drill press. I also went ahead and drilled a hole for the knob while I was at the drill press. Once the holes were drilled, I attached the hinges to the door using the included screws, and then attached the other half of the hinges to the inside of the IKEA cabinet. There are screws on these hinges to adjust the spacing around the outside edges of the frame, and once the spacing was even, I added the knob and a catch for the door, and the door was complete. All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. This one was a lot of fun. Obviously, you can customize this for whatever albums you like. It's a pretty inexpensive project, especially if you make multiples of them, and it looks really, really cool. A couple things I didn't show on camera. Since this door has a pretty large gap on all sides, I had to add some spacers underneath where the hinges attach to the side here. That way I could kind of get everything centered. I just used some little scraps of 1/4 inch plywood. Other than that, it turned out great. The spacing actually came out really nice. The album artwork looks outstanding, especially in person. I think it was hard to really capture on film how great this looks. The epoxy added so much to it. If you're gonna do this, I would definitely recommend doing that. It's also gonna just make this wear a lot better. I just love how smooth the motion of the door is. The walnut veneer plywood looks awesome on the inside. I'm really glad I went with that rather than just a plain basic plywood. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. If you don't already, maybe consider getting subscribed. I have new project videos like this every Tuesday. Also, again, I have links to all of the products I used in the video description below. And last, if you want to support me a little further, see some behind the scenes stuff and get some maybe free plans, check me out on Patreon. It's patreon.com/craftedworkshop. Thanks again for watching, guys, and until next time, happy building.